Hi everyone, and welcome to the next video number 4 in World War One and the Western Front. Now this particular video, it's all about how the soldiers and the Western Front in the trenches, how they were dealt with if or when they got wounded. Now there were millions of British soldiers in the Western Front, in the trenches throughout the 4 years. And here's quite a striking statistic, ladies and gentlemen. If you were a normal soldier in World War One, you had a 1 in 2 chance of either being killed, wounded or captured on the Western Front. So if there are millions there, then there's the first problem. There were a huge number of casualties to be dealt with by the British Army. In this video, we're going to have a look at 2 things. 1, the types of groups of medical people who got involved, helping the soldiers, and 2, how they actually helped them along the way from the trench and then in some cases all the way back to Britain. So there's 2 parts to this video. Now the first part, here are some of the medical groups. The first one, VAD. VAD. Now those letters stood for Volunteer Aid Detachments. Volunteers, there to help, aid. They were often women, often very posh women, and they did the basic things there, the cooking, the cleaning, the washing. Now, remember what I've said before about the British soldiers often had little funny words and they made up names. VAD. Instead of Volunteer Aid Detachments, the British soldiers called them Very Active Dusters because they went round cleaning. Very active dusters. I'm very busy doing some dusting. That's the first group, the VAD. The second group, probably more important for you, particularly maybe answering in the exam. The RAMC, Royal Army Medical Corps. They were the key group really. Now in 1914, there were 9,000 of them. The Medical Corps, they've got medical training. They are involved in bringing the wounded soldiers out and dealing with them. 9,000 at the start of the war. At the end of the war, 1918, 113,000. Wow. What does that tell you about the World War One and the amount of wounded soldiers there were? We've gone from just under 10,000 to over 100,000. A huge increase in the numbers of the RAMC, and they were involved in every step of the way dealing with the wounded soldiers. An important group. The third group, linked in a way to the RAMC, the Queen Alexandra nurses. They worked in some of the hospitals along the route. Again, 1914, start of the war, there were 300 of them. 1918, towards the end of the war, there were 10,000. Again, a huge increase in the number of nurses, the Queen Alexandra nurses. And the fourth and the final group, FANY. FANY, First Aid Nursing Yeomanry Corps. Again, women. Okay, now what did they do? They had some first aid training. Maybe not quite as much as the RAMC, but they've got first aid training. They are trained in signalling, driving, their responsibility. Here's a change for the role of women. Probably wouldn't have been like this before the war, but in the need in the war to get things done, women were trained and they did the driving the ambulances, moving the soldiers back down to get treatment, the FANY, and they brought them all the way to the coast. And there were 2 main areas. The first one, the Calais convoy, sailing from Calais back to Britain, and the second one, the Saint-Omer convoy, sailing from Saint-Omer back to Britain. So the FANY did very, very important work as well. Now, some of the countries involved, they awarded more than 50 bravery medals to members of the FANY. So they were very brave women. So there we have the 4 key groups: the VAD, the Dusters, the RAMC, the Queen Alexandra Nurses, and FANY, First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. They're the 4 groups involved in dealing with the wounded soldiers. Next question. How would they get, or how would they treat the soldiers all the way from the battlefield back to Britain? A good question. Try and think of it like links along the way. You could call it a chain of evacuation. Evacuation, bringing people out, making them safer. And there are links, there are different stages all the way along the journey from the battlefield to Britain. Number 1, soldiers on the battlefield, often in no man's land, injured, wounded. They would have to be recovered. They would have to be brought back to the trench. Now, that was a very, very important job. And who did it? Number 1, stage number 1, the stretcher bearers. They were brave people. They would go out onto no man's land. They're not fighting. They haven't got a rifle. They're there to carry the wounded soldiers back. But remember, we know that some of the conditions in no man's land, all the shelling, the bombardment, craters often filled with water, very, very thick mud in some parts of Flanders, it was difficult. The terrain made it difficult. So the stretcher bearers had a very tiring, dangerous, difficult job. They brought with them basic medical supplies, bandages, pain relief, and they might deal with the wounded soldier there in no man's land and then bring him back to the trench. 16 stretcher bearers per battalion, sometimes working in 2s, sometimes working in 4s. Now a battalion might have 1,000 men, so they've got 16 men looking after 1,000. Very brave. Sometimes these men were conscientious objectors. Have you ever heard of that term? It's people who didn't believe in fighting, but some of them were willing to help their country. They didn't want to fight, so instead they volunteered for this very dangerous job. The stretcher bearers, stage 1 in the chain of evacuation. Now, as we move through these different stages of the chain of evacuation, sometimes referred to as the field ambulance. They included stretcher bearers, sometimes horses, carts, wagons. Later on in the war, maybe after about 1915, we get motor vehicles, the field ambulance, bringing the wounded soldiers back. Stage 2, we get the RAP. RAP? Oh, chance to do a rap. Excellent news. Yo. Sorry. Now, what sort of rap have we got? Mud and water, rats and lice. Trench life often wasn't nice. Head wounds caused by a soft cap. Quick, take him back to the rap. Rap, yes. Now, what am I on about, the rap? It's not one of these raps, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, my rap there was terrible. Of course it is. I'm old and past it. But the RAP here, stage 2 in the chain of evacuation, very, very important. RAP stands for Regimental Aid Post. It was like the first real sort of medical place where the soldiers could get some sort of treatment apart from just very basic stuff given by the stretcher bearers. It was still quite close to the fighting. There was a medical officer there whose job it was to inspect the wounds and say, right, we can deal with this one. Quick, bandage, you're back to the trench. Off you go. No, this is too serious. You need to go back along the chain of evacuation. Whether you can walk, fine, or if you need to be carried, stretcher bearers, or if you need the field ambulance, either horses and carts or the motor vehicles. Let's get you back down the next chain in the evacuation process. So stage number 2 was the RAP. Sorry, lose the hat. Put a proper hat on, that's better. But notice it's still soft, so it might not do any good at all for protecting your head. And we'll deal with that in another video later. Stage 3. We've gone stretcher bearers, wrap. We're now on to the dressing stations. Dressing as in dressing the wound. Now, these were divided into 2 little subsections. The first one, the advanced dressing station, ADS, nearer to the trench, maybe about 400 meters behind the wrap. So still quite close to the actual fighting. And again, at the advanced dressing station, there are tents, there are dugouts, there might be some buildings, and it's another sorting out process. Again, there are medical people there. We call it today in our hospitals triage, where you first go to the hospital, accident and emergency, and they look at you straight away. Say, right, you're very important, in you go. Right, you can wait. It's not quite as serious. So at the advanced dressing station, the dressing stations are stage 3. And there again, there's a sorting out exercise. If you are serious, you go back down to the main dressing station. Not the advanced one, the proper one, the main dressing station. We're now up to maybe a mile, 2 kilometers away from the front line. Here, again, more checks, more medical inspections. How serious are you? Can we deal with you here? Yes, we can. Fine. No, we can't. Okay, you need to go to the next stage in the chain of evacuation, which is stage 4. Stage 4, CCS. Casualty clearing stations. Now these might be anywhere between 5 to 10 miles away from the fighting. So we've brought you quite a long way away now. You must be quite seriously ill. The chain of evacuation is it's set up to return you to fighting if possible. But as you go further down, you're obviously more seriously wounded. So stage 4, the CCS, casualty clearing stations. Now, this is probably the first proper, well-equipped medical facility. There might be 5, 10 doctors there, and nurses, Queen Alexandra nurses. And there's equipment. There's a mobile X-ray unit, very important. Why do you think? Fragments, explosions. The X-ray unit can see where all the fragments are, can see the internal damage. Mobile X-ray units. There's wards. It is sort of a hospital. There are wards for hundreds of men. And you might be treated there for 2 to 4 weeks. And hopefully repaired. You recover. Return to the front. Stage 4. But if not, if that is still not working, or you're obviously too seriously ill, stage 5. The 5th and final chain in the evacuation process. Stage 5, base hospitals. Now this is even further away. Real proper hospitals, often near really good transport links, whether they're road, train or canal. Remember, sometimes on a barge it's quite smooth. That might be good if you've got a terrible injury. You don't want to be jumped and knocked around on the terrible roads which might have craters in and all the mud. So the base hospitals were often built near proper transport links. It's the best equipped. It's better equipped than the CCS, the casualty clearing station. It's bigger. There's more specialist doctors there who are experienced at the types of injury that they were seeing in World War I. We'll deal with that in a later video. They've got X-ray machines, not the mobile ones, bigger ones, permanently there. They've got proper operating theatres. Some of the others had operating theatres all the way back to the CCS. But these were better. They've got laboratories to do tests. And again, soldiers were treated, often 2,000, 3,000 soldiers in the base hospitals. And again, recovery, return to the front, or still too serious, let's get you back to Britain. So you go from the base hospital to the port, onto the ship, return to Britain, where hopefully you'll get even better treatment to return to the war. Of course, some people never returned. Their wounds, their injuries were so severe that they never ever went back to the war. So there we see the different medical groups: VAD, RAMC, Queen Alexandra Nurses, FANY. The FANY, remember, they're the ones who are bringing the soldiers back down the chain of evacuation. Remember I said about mobile x-rays? Well, the FANY also had with them mobile bathing units, and they could sometimes bathe up to 40 soldiers per hour. Yeah, it's quite good going. Mobiles. We'll do more about that in later videos. So, we've seen the medical groups involved. We've seen the chain of evacuation. Stretcher, RAP, dressing stations, casualty clearing stations, base hospitals. Now, one way to remember them, think of the alphabet. Stretcher, S. RAP, R. Dressing, D. Casualty, C. Base, B. S, R, D, C, B. It's the alphabet the wrong way. Instead of B being towards the start of the alphabet, we're starting towards the end. S, R, D, C, B. 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 That might help you remember the order. Alphabetically, it's in reverse as they go further away from the trench back towards Britain. So they're the medical groups, and that's how they dealt with the millions of wounded men. What we're going to have a look in the next videos. You'll be pleased, there's no terrible raps, that's good news. But what we will look at is, number one, what illnesses did the soldiers get in the trenches? And then, what types of wounds and injuries did they get in the trenches? So they're coming next. Hope it's been useful. Speak to you soon. All the best now.